I never thought I'd have to lock people inside my own property just to convince them it wasn't theirs. But that's exactly what happened. And the crazy part is, by the time it was over, a real estate developer was paying me every month for a driveway he had spent months pretending belonged to everyone. Looking back now, it almost sounds ridiculous, like one of those neighborhood stories people exaggerate over beers at a backyard barbecue. Except every bit of it actually happened. My name's Ethan Walker, and for almost 12 years I'd lived on a quiet piece of land outside a small town called Maple Creek, Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just a little over 2 acres, a white farmhouse that needed paint more often than I wanted to admit, a red barn my grandfather helped me build, and a gravel driveway that curved across a small wooden bridge before connecting to the county road. It wasn't some grand estate, but it was mine. That's what mattered. The thing I loved most about that property wasn't the house or even the land itself. It was the peace. Most mornings started with coffee on the porch, watching deer move through the trees while the world slowly woke up. You could hear birds, wind, maybe a tractor in the distance. What you couldn't hear was traffic, at least not back then. Everything changed when construction started across the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. A company called Summit Ridge Development bought a large parcel and announced a small neighborhood project called Oak Hollow Estates. 9 houses, new families, nice-looking homes. Seemed harmless enough. In fact, I figured it might even help property values. The owner of the company was a guy named Garrett Cole. If you've ever met someone who walks into every room like he already owns it, that's Garrett. Expensive truck, expensive watch, perfect smile, and a habit of talking to people like he was doing them a favor simply by acknowledging they existed. We met briefly during the first week of construction. He came over, introduced himself, shook my hand, and spent 10 minutes explaining how successful the project would be. I remember standing there thinking it was strange that he talked almost entirely about himself. Not once did he ask anything about me or my property. At the time, I brushed it off. A few weeks later, I started noticing strange vehicles using my driveway. At first, it was only construction workers, then delivery vans, then random SUVs. One day, I looked out my kitchen window and saw a landscaping truck drive straight across my bridge, loop around near the barn, and leave through a connecting side road beyond my property line. I honestly thought they were lost, so I walked down and put up a sign. Private drive. No through traffic. Simple, polite, impossible to misunderstand. Or so I thought. The sign might as well have been invisible. People kept using the driveway. Some slowed down long enough to read it and then ignored it anyway. Every evening, I'd find fresh tire tracks in the gravel. Every morning, another unfamiliar vehicle would roll through like they paid the mortgage. What really got under my skin wasn't the inconvenience. It was the assumption. Nobody asked. Nobody knocked on my door. They just decided my property existed for their convenience. And once people start doing that, they rarely stop on their own. Things escalated on a Saturday afternoon. I was repairing a fence post near the barn when I heard multiple vehicles approaching. I looked up and saw 3 shiny SUVs slowly driving across my bridge. Behind them was a woman wearing a blazer and carrying a stack of brochures. A realtor. The vehicles followed her like ducklings. They circled around the barn while she pointed toward the road beyond my property. I dropped my tools and walked over. "Can I help you?" I asked. She smiled like we were old friends. "We're just showing buyers an alternate access route into Oak Hollow." I stared at her for a second because I honestly thought I had misheard her. "Alternate access route?" I said. "You're standing on private property." Her smile didn't disappear. In fact, it somehow got bigger. Then she handed me one of the brochures. "This route has been included in our presentation materials." I looked down. There it was. A map. And on that map, my driveway was drawn like it belonged to the subdivision. My actual driveway. My bridge. My land. I felt my stomach tighten. You know that feeling when you're angry, but still too surprised to fully process it? That's where I was. I pointed at the map. "Who approved this?" The realtor glanced at the logo. Mr. Cole's office provided everything. Garrett, of course. The buyers looked uncomfortable. One older couple exchanged glances. Another guy quietly backed toward his vehicle. Nobody wanted to be standing there anymore. I called Garrett the second they left. He answered on the third ring. Before I could even finish explaining what I was looking at, he laughed. Actually laughed. "Ethan, relax," he said. "It's temporary." Temporary. That's the word people use when they want permission without asking for it. You put my private driveway on your sales material. It's helping traffic flow until the county improves the main road. "Did you ask me?" Silence for half a second. Then he changed subjects. That's when I knew exactly what kind of game he was playing. He wasn't confused. He wasn't mistaken. He knew it wasn't his property. He simply didn't care. After we hung up, I sat on the porch for nearly an hour watching vehicles move in and out of the development. The sun was setting, turning everything orange, and for the first time since I'd bought that place, the property didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt occupied. Not physically occupied, but mentally, like someone had decided ownership was negotiable. The next morning, I drove into town and started asking questions, because if Garrett wanted to play games, I wanted facts. I wanted records. I wanted paperwork. And what I learned over the next 48 hours would completely change the direction of this story and eventually lead to one of the most satisfying Friday afternoons of my entire life. The first stop was the county records office. Now, if you've never spent time inside one of those places, imagine a building where excitement goes to die. Beige walls, fluorescent lights, old filing cabinets, and employees who have seen every property dispute known to mankind. I walked in carrying copies of the brochure and a notebook full of questions. An older clerk named Martha helped me. She had the kind of expression that suggested nothing surprised her anymore. I explained the situation and asked a simple question. "Is there any recorded easement on my property?" She typed for a few minutes, clicked through several screens, then looked up. "Nope." I asked again, just to make sure. "Nothing." She shook her head. "Not a thing. No access easement. No utility easement across that bridge. No shared use agreement. As far as county records are concerned, that driveway is entirely yours." I can't explain how satisfying that answer felt. Not because I wanted to fight, but because I finally knew where I stood. Garrett had no legal claim, no hidden agreement, no technical loophole. He had simply decided that my property was useful and assumed nobody would stop him. On the drive home, I kept thinking about something my grandfather used to say. People don't respect boundaries until boundaries become inconvenient. Up until that point, my boundary had been assigned. Clearly, that wasn't enough. The following week, I started making phone calls. Not to lawyers. Not yet. Instead, I called a contractor who specialized in gates and fencing. Then I called a security company. Then I called another contractor who handled steel post installations. By Wednesday, trucks were arriving at my property. The first thing we installed was a row of heavy steel support posts near the bridge entrance. People noticed immediately. Construction workers from Oak Hollow slowed down to stare. A couple of realtors parked across the road and watched from their cars. By Thursday afternoon, the gate arrived. It was beautiful. Heavy black steel. Commercial grade. Keypad access on the inside. Manual lock on the outside. Solid enough that nobody was accidentally driving through it. When the installers finished, I stood there looking at it and honestly smiled. Not because I wanted conflict, because for the first time in months, I felt like my property belonged to me again. Friday morning was unusually busy at Oak Hollow. New model homes were opening. Sales banners were everywhere. Flags lined the road. Food trucks had been hired. Garrett was clearly planning a major sales weekend. Around noon, I noticed the first group of vehicles entering my driveway. Then another. Then another. Apparently nobody had updated the sales team. They were still using my property as the shortcut. I watched from the porch with a glass of iced tea. About 20 minutes later, 6 vehicles were beyond the bridge. 2 realtor SUVs. 3 prospective buyers. 1 contractor truck. Then I walked down to the gate. Slowly. Calmly. And I closed it. The sound echoed across the property. Clang. Not dramatic. Not aggressive. Just final. I locked it and walked away. It took about 5 minutes before people realized something had changed. The first realtor approached the gate and started pushing buttons. Nothing happened. Then another vehicle pulled up behind her. Then another. Soon there was a small line of confused drivers trapped between the barn and the bridge. One woman spotted me walking back toward the house and started waving her arms. I kept walking. Eventually, I returned. By then, frustration had fully arrived. "You need to open this immediately," one realtor snapped. "What?" I asked. "Because people need to leave. They can leave. The gate is locked." Yes. The silence that followed was incredible. You could almost see everyone processing what had happened. A younger realtor finally spoke up. "This is ridiculous." I nodded. "You know what's also ridiculous? Selling property access you don't own." A couple standing near one of the SUVs suddenly became very interested in the gravel beneath their feet. They clearly hadn't expected to become part of a property dispute while shopping for a home. One man finally asked, "Wait, this isn't part of the development?" I looked at him. Not even a little. The embarrassment on the realtor's face was worth every penny I spent on that gate. Eventually, they had to back out the long way. One vehicle at a time. Carefully. Slowly. It took almost 25 minutes. The shortcut that supposedly saved everyone time ended up costing them far more. I thought that would be the end of it. It wasn't. Monday morning, my phone exploded. Missed calls, voicemails, text messages. Garrett finally reached me around 10 o'clock. He was furious. Not irritated. Furious. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded. "Protecting my property. You can't block access like that." "Actually, I can. What if emergency vehicles need that route?" There it was. The argument people always make when they run out of better ones. I waited for him to finish. Then I asked one question. "Show me the easement." Silence. Not a brief silence. A long one. The kind where somebody realizes their position just collapsed. Finally, he muttered something about attorneys and liability before ending the call. The next few weeks became a strange little war. Every time Garrett adjusted, I adjusted too. He removed references to the driveway from some materials. I added larger signs. He instructed contractors not to use the shortcut. Some ignored him anyway. I installed additional cameras. He told sales agents to verbally describe the route instead of printing it. I placed highly visible, no trespassing notices near the bridge. It became almost comical. One afternoon, I reviewed camera footage and counted 7 separate vehicles that approached the entrance, saw the signs, saw the gate, then turned around. Word was spreading, but not fast enough. The final piece of the puzzle came from my neighbor, Frank. Frank had lived down the road for nearly 30 years and knew everyone. One evening, he stopped by carrying a six-pack and sat on my porch. We talked while watching the sunset. After hearing the latest update, he laughed so hard he nearly spilled his drink. Then he gave me a suggestion. "You know what really changes behavior?" he asked. "Consequences." The next morning, I called a towing company. I explained the situation, showed them documentation, showed them the property lines, showed them the signs. They agreed immediately. 3 days later, a contractor ignored every warning posted near the entrance and drove across anyway. 15 minutes later, his truck was gone. The reaction was spectacular. Angry phone calls, confused supervisors, lots of finger-pointing. But something remarkable happened after that. Almost overnight, the traffic disappeared. Realtors stopped using the shortcut. Delivery drivers stopped experimenting. Contractors found other routes. It was as if my driveway had become invisible. For the first time in months, mornings were quiet again. I started noticing small things I hadn't realized I'd missed. Birds returning to the trees. Gravel staying smooth instead of being churned up all day. Even my dogs seemed calmer. Yet despite all that, I knew the story wasn't finished. Because people like Garrett rarely accept defeat quietly. They negotiate only after every shortcut stops working. Sure enough, about 2 weeks later, I received a message asking if we could meet face-to-face. No lawyers, no threats, just a conversation. And based on the tone of that message alone, I had a feeling the man who showed up next wasn't going to be the same confident developer who had laughed at me on the phone months earlier. 2 days later, Garrett pulled into my driveway, just after lunch. The difference between this visit and our first meeting months earlier was impossible to miss. The expensive truck was still there. The expensive watch was still there. The confidence wasn't. Back when construction started, he walked around like the entire county existed to support his project. This time he sat in the driver's seat for nearly a minute before getting out. That alone told me everything I needed to know. We ended up sitting at my kitchen table. Nothing formal. Just 2 coffee mugs, a stack of property records, and a conversation that probably should have happened from the beginning. For a while, neither of us said much. Garrett looked around the room, studying family photos on the wall. Pictures of my parents. My grandfather. The old barn when it was first built. I think that was the moment he finally understood something he had never bothered to consider before. To him, my property had been a route on a map. To me, it was home. Eventually, he cleared his throat. What would it take? Just like that. No arguments. No threats. No speeches about community benefits. Just one honest question. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him for a moment. Months earlier, that question would have irritated me. Now it almost felt refreshing. You really want to know? I asked. He nodded. So I laid everything out. If he wanted legal access across the bridge, there would need to be a recorded easement filed with the county. There would be an upfront payment. There would be a monthly access fee. There would be a maintenance fund specifically for repairs to the bridge and driveway. There would be proof of insurance naming me as an additional insured party. There would be strict limitations regarding traffic volume. And if any of those conditions were violated, access could be suspended. Garrett listened quietly. Every now and then he scribbled notes. When I finished, he stared at the paper for several seconds. Then he laughed. Not the arrogant laugh from before. More like the laugh of someone realizing how expensive bad decisions can become. That's a lot of money, he said. I shrugged. So is building a subdivision with terrible access planning. For the first time all afternoon, I saw him smile. A real smile. Not a sales smile. Not a politician's smile. Just genuine acknowledgement that he'd been beaten fair and square. The negotiations continued for another couple of weeks. Attorneys got involved. Surveyors reviewed documents. Insurance agents exchanged paperwork. There were plenty of small disagreements, but the important part never changed. Garrett no longer acted like the driveway belonged to him. Now he was asking permission to use it. That's a very different conversation. Eventually, we reached an agreement. The final numbers were simple. $3,000 up front, $1,500 every month, a dedicated maintenance account, full insurance coverage, county recorded easement documents, signed, filed, legal, clean. For the first time since the entire mess started, everything was official. The funny thing is, after all those months of frustration, anger, and conflict, the actual signing took less than 20 minutes. Sometimes the biggest battles end with nothing more dramatic than a pen touching paper. A week later, I stood on the porch drinking coffee when the first authorized vehicle used the driveway under the new agreement. I expected to feel annoyed. Instead, I felt oddly peaceful, because the issue had never really been about traffic. It had been about respect. If someone asks, if someone follows the rules, if someone recognizes your rights, most problems become manageable. What drives people crazy is entitlement. And that's exactly what had caused this entire situation in the first place. Over the following months, life gradually returned to normal. Oak Hollow finished construction. Families moved in. Kids rode bicycles down the sidewalks. Neighbors waved from front porches. The drama faded into local history. Every once in a while, someone new would hear the story and ask if it was true. I'd usually point toward the bridge and laugh. Every word. Frank still liked telling the story better than I did. According to him, I had single-handedly defeated a developer with a gate and a padlock. The reality was less dramatic. I didn't defeat anyone. I simply refused to surrender something that belonged to me. There's a difference. One evening nearly a year later, I saw Garrett again during a community event. We talked for a few minutes. Surprisingly, things weren't awkward. In fact, he admitted something I'd never expected to hear. He told me the conflict had forced his company to rethink how they handled neighboring property owners. Apparently, my driveway became a case study inside their business. I laughed when he said that. Imagine building an entire corporate lesson around one stubborn guy with a gravel road. But maybe that's the point. The biggest lessons often come from the smallest boundaries. To this day, every time I pass that gate, I remember the moment it closed. Not because people got trapped. Not because Garrett lost money. Not because I won. I remember it because that was the exact moment someone else's assumption collided with reality. A property line isn't just a legal concept. It's a promise. It says this space belongs to someone. Their time, their effort, their investment, their life. Ignore that long enough, and eventually reality pushes back. Sometimes reality arrives in the form of attorneys. Sometimes it's a judge, and sometimes it's just a heavy steel gate closing on a Friday afternoon. But here's the part people still argue about whenever I tell this story. Some think I should have been more cooperative from the beginning. Others think Garrett deserved far worse than a monthly fee. I've heard both sides. Maybe there's truth in each of them. If he'd asked first, I probably would have worked with him. If I'd reacted emotionally, things could have become much uglier. Instead, both of us ended up learning something. He learned that convenience doesn't create ownership. And I learned that standing your ground doesn't always require shouting. Sometimes patience is stronger than anger. Sometimes paperwork is stronger than threats. And sometimes the most effective way to teach a lesson is to let people experience the consequences of their own choices. So now I want to hear what you think. If you were in my position, would you have installed the gate? Would you have charged the developer for access or refused entirely? And if you were Garrett, do you think he was simply being practical, or was he completely out of line from the start? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because I can already tell this is one of those stories where people are going to land on very different sides. And if you've ever dealt with a neighbor, developer, HOA, or anyone else who acted like your property belonged to them, share your story too. Trust me, after what happened with that driveway, I know those stories are a lot more common than most people think.